In 1945, a Hollywood actress was dragged from a courtroom screaming.
And in 2008, a pop star was strapped to a gurney and taken away in an ambulance.
Different decades, same headlines. She's gone mad. She's gone crazy.
Frances Farmer and Britney Spears, two women who found out exactly what happens when you're famous, female and having a breakdown in public.
Today, from Victorian asylums to Instagram comments, we're talking about how easy it is to brand a woman hysterical or crazy.
And if you've ever been called emotional, difficult or too much,
this one's for you.
Let's go straight to the comments.
You know, hysteria was actually the first mental disorder that was attributable just to women, which goes back as far as the ancient Egyptians and was blamed on, of all things, spontaneous uterus movement within the female body.
I remember you said that in a previous episode and I didn't forget it when they were talking about the wandering womb.
I know. Where's it going? I actually saw this comment online that said, what were they smoking when they came up with the idea that the uterus started wandering around the body? Yeah, I have no idea what they were smoking, but I think in terms of the hysterical woman, we really do think of the Victorian era because it was such a common diagnosis at the time for women, just for basically a wide range of symptoms, including anxiety, faintness, insomnia, and even irritability.
So basically any emotion and you could be called hysterical.
Yeah, pretty much. And apparently most women at the time, they carried a bottle of smelling salts in their handbag because if their emotions were aroused, they might swoon. But because apparently, I don't know how they knew this, but the wandering womb hated the pungent odour, it would then immediately return to its place so she could recover her consciousness.
I mean, how did they even come up with that? I always think of the Victorians, they always had these ridiculous ideas and treatments.
They really did. I mean, suggested cures actually ranged from horseback riding and childbirth to pelvic massage and, well, what's essentially vibrators, I guess.
Yeah, maybe we have that to thank them for. But look, there's actually a film about this called Hysteria with Maggie Gyllenhaal.
Yeah, I've actually seen that. And look, the film does portray it in a really light-hearted and humorous way. But in reality, women considered hysterical could also be forced to have hysterectomies. They could be lobotomized, or they could even just be locked up in asylums for years.
There does seem to be like this enduring fascination with asylums.
I think as a society, the reason that we're so fascinated by this is actually summed up in this comment that said, asylums and psychiatric hospitals recur in horror fiction because they combine deep cultural fears, dramatic narrative opportunities, and ready-made sensory detail that amplify unease and moral ambiguity.
And, you know, they've always been one of my deepest nightmares. You know, this idea that you're like having to prove that you're sane in an asylum and no one believes you.
Well, there's this, I can't remember who said it, but I remember this quote that says, the more you tell people you're not mad, the madder you look. And I just think that's so true and so scary.
I know, and that's exactly my nightmare.
We'll make it through. You know, the other element as well for me is that there's such a strong voyeuristic element of mental illness as entertainment. So back in the day, there were a lot of notorious psychiatric hospitals like Bethlehem Royal Hospital, and it was even nicknamed Bedlam. And it essentially functioned like a zoo, so the public were allowed to come and observe the patients, and they even called them inmates at the time.
I mean, it would just be horrific enough to be thrown into asylum, but then to be some sort of form of entertainment. I mean, it's just so twisted. Really?
It really is, yeah. And not just that, but actresses who were portraying Ophelia on stage, they were invited to visit the asylum so that they could observe mad women, basically for artistic inspiration.
I just don't think the Victorians were the most sensitive people. But
no.
What I find interesting is at the moment, Taylor Swift, you know, she's having a real moment with that song, The Fate of Ophelia. But it does seem to have that message that a broken heart or not having a man love you can literally drive you mad.
Yeah, I think, you know what's so interesting is I think it's the way women's lives have always been presented as a response to men. So obviously a bad breakup or losing someone you love can definitely trigger grief and extreme depression, and that can sometimes feel like you're losing your mind. But it also feels like the idea of being an Ophelia is romanticised in some way. So Beth Squire, she wrote in Vice, for decades, the overwhelmingly male artistic representation remained surprisingly consistent. Messy hair, disjointed speech, glassy eyes, inappropriate nudity. For centuries, men have reframed mental illness as something romantic, even sexy.
I do think that vulnerability is the key ingredient here. It's not that she's just ill, it's that the illness makes her available somehow and accessible.
I think that's one aspect, but it's also the damsel in distress quality. And it really gives them this chance to ride in on their horse and save her. As long, though, and this is a really important part, as long as she's beautiful. Because when talking about the archetype of the sexy, doomed, sad girl in films, Jamie Loftus said, "She's so sad, but she's beautiful. Anytime a mentally ill character is not attractive, when is that character saved? When is that character given the correct amount of attention in the plot or by anyone in the movie?"
Well, when I think about the sort of spectrum of troubled women in films, I'm thinking Glenn Close in Fatal Attraction, Winona and Angelina in Girl Interrupted, and even Kirsten Dunst in literally that film called Crazy Beautiful.
I mean, it pretty much says it all in the title. When I think about those films, though, for me, it's about women being split into two camps of crazy. You have the sexy crazy like in Betty Blue, or you have the scary crazy like in Misery.
Yes.
And you could usually predict which camp they were going to be in depending on their looks or their age.
Oh, absolutely. But it is absolutely terrifying that women could be institutionalised for potentially being a bit different. I actually remember reading about Charles Dickens, who tried to have his wife put in an asylum to get rid of her. A friend of his wife, Catherine, wrote about it saying, "She had borne 10 children and had lost many of her good looks, was growing old. In fact, he even tried to shut her up in a lunatic asylum. Poor thing. But bad as the law is in regard to proof of insanity, he could not quite wrest it to his purpose."
Jesus, so she has 10 of his kids. When she's no longer young and pretty, he then tries to have her locked up so he can replace her. But luckily, it sounds like he didn't succeed.
No, and as this one commentator said, "This reminds me of the yellow wallpaper. Just another way to discredit and dehumanise women. Sounds like he really put the dick in Dickens that year."
That's an excellent comment. I like that one.
I know.
Well, even though the doctor didn't side with him, I was actually looking at a Reddit post that had found a list of reasons people had been admitted to an asylum in the 1860s. And I'm just going to read out some of that list because it's the mind boggles, really, to be honest. So, intemperance, business trouble, imaginary female trouble, I don't really know what that is, immoral life, dissolute habits, laziness, masturbation for 30 years, or it can also be called deranged masturbation. Yeah, you don't want to do that deranged. Mental excitement, novel reading, overaction of the mind, periodical fits, political excitement, grief, seduction and disappointment, and of course, stimulants.
Oh my God, what a list. This is killing me. I mean, let's be honest. We would be in there, Sarah, with adjoining rooms.
Yeah, you know what? Yeah. 100%. We wouldn't have stood a chance. I actually saw a comment that said, "I'm not even a quarter of the way through. How did any woman not get looked up?" But in quite a sobering response was this one. "It's more about having a reason at the ready when you needed to lock up any specific woman."
I mean, imagine that dangling over your head, that they could put you in an asylum.
Yeah, especially if you go into a library, apparently. Look, it's not just being locked up that women had to worry about. So more lobotomies were performed on women than men. A 1951 study found that nearly 60% of American lobotomy patients were women. And limited data showed that 74% of lobotomies in Ontario from 1948 to 52 were performed on female patients.
74%. I mean, that is so frightening. I mean, okay, well, look, this brings us to the case of Frances Farmer.
When we actually first started discussing this topic in response to the latest spotlight that Britney Spears have been put under with the new book by Kevin Federline, you actually said to me that it made you think of Frances Farmer.
Yes, it did. And I was telling you about how I watched this film Frances with Jessica Lange many years ago. I was in my early 20s. Well, she plays Frances. She's this beautiful Hollywood film star in the 1930s. Frances has everything going for her. She's even starred in a film with Cary Grant. But she ends up being thrown in an asylum, first by a judge, but then by her own mother, who keeps her there. She has guardianship over her. And the horrific climax of the film is actually her being forcibly lobotomized. And look, this scene really disturbed me. So just a bit of a trigger warning. If you don't want to hear it, just skip ahead.
In plain language, my ice pick technique severs the nerves that deliver emotional energy to ideas. Along with the cure comes a loss of affect, a kind of emotional flattening with diminished creativity and imagination. But after all, it is their imaginations and emotions that are disturbed. However, this patient here will soon be leaving the hospital. Lobotomy gets him home.
God, it does feel like they're erasing what's essentially her true self.
Yeah.
But you also sent me that famous photo of Frances being arrested and dragged away by police officers who she's actually fighting. And it must have been so shocking at the time. And it really reminded me of those now iconic photos of Britney shaving her head or attacking the paparazzi's car with the umbrella. And it's almost like no matter what happens going forward, their worst moment is caught on camera and they'll never be able to escape it.
And it's like they're frozen in time and we have no context to what led up to it. There's just there's this crazy woman. But look, we're going to get into Britney properly later. But Frances Farmer definitely became the poster child for the medically abused tragic actress character. There was this comment: "A story of a star falling from grace and falling victim to their own issues is a more entertaining story than them overcoming them."
And actually in 1972, Kenneth Anger released a scrapbook. It was called Hollywood Babylon, and it included sensationalist photos of her taken in jail. And he actually refers to her as Saint Francis, patron of all the Hollywood Magdalenes who've drunk at the well of madness.
I mean, that's quite a quote. And it definitely sets her up for the mythic tragic heroine status. But she sort of disappeared from the mainstream consciousness until her story was resurrected in this 1982 film. And of course, the 1993 Nirvana song, Frances Farmer Will Have Her Revenge on Seattle. And talking about the song, Kurt Cobain said, "I guess that's my way of letting the world know that bureaucracy is everywhere and it can happen to anybody and it's a really evil thing." It almost felt like it was happening to us. And when he says us, he's talking about him and Courtney Love.
Well, before we actually started researching this episode, I actually hadn't heard of Frances Farmer, which I feel is a real oversight because I've always been fascinated by both the golden Hollywood era and really anything to do with mental illness, specifically from the perspective of women. Mm-hmm. And, you know, I have to admit, as a student, my friend and I, we had portraits of Virginia Woolf and Sylvia Plath in our living room. For example, The Mad Woman in the Attic and Mad, Bad and Sad. So, you know, quite a lot of those.
Sarah, I'm not surprised. I can imagine your flat was an absolute shrine to doomed female genius. I can see it already.
Just mirrors everywhere. No.
Gosh.
Okay, so let's just recap her story for anyone who, like me, isn't familiar with it.
Well, I think the most interesting part about Frances Farmer is the gap between the reality and her myth. Kurt Cobain read the book Shadowlands by William Arnold, and I just want to play this clip of him summarising her life. And again, just a bit of a trigger warning, as some of it could be a bit upsetting.
They, had some pictures taken of her when she was arrested for drunk driving, and it was a big, huge scandal, and she eventually was sent to a mental institution and given a lobotomy and raped every day for years and just totally abused, and ended up, working at a Four Seasons restaurant alone and dying by herself.
I can really see how her story resonated with him because he must have felt like him and Courtney were being hounded by the media and demonized. But you mentioned the myth versus the reality. So how much of his account was actually true?
So Frances Farmer was originally from Seattle. And as I mentioned earlier, she was a rising star in the 1930s, but her career declined rapidly in the 1940s. By 1942, she'd already gained a reputation for being difficult to work with.
I really feel like that's a classic phrase that they use about certain actresses. Yeah. You know, they've called Lindsay Lohan and Katherine Heigl that. And it does feel like a way of saying either that they have an addiction or they're just too opinionated. But essentially, once you get that reputation, it's really hard to shake.
Well, with Frances, she was arrested in 1942 for driving under the influence and without a licence. This led to a suspended jail sentence and a fine. But when she broke her parole agreements and was accused of assaulting a hairstylist on a film set, she was brought back to court where she threw an inkwell at the judge, admitted to regularly drinking Benzedrine, which I'm not quite sure what that is.
It's actually a liquid amphetamine, so pretty hardcore.
Fuck. Okay, well, look, that's pretty intense. So, look, she was forcibly hospitalised into a psychiatric facility after being dragged from the court screaming, "Have you ever had a broken heart?"
Wow,
I know.
That's quite a performance. It does sound like she had a problem with substances that did lead to some, let's call it, pretty erratic behaviour. But it also sounds like the way she was treated just made things a lot worse. Oh, yeah. We know at the time the studios used to put all the stars on uppers and downers to control them. Judy Garland is such a classic example of this.
The thing is with Frances, she was actually diagnosed with manic psychosis, was then institutionalised multiple times for a period spanning over a decade, and she underwent controversial treatments including insulin shock therapy and electric shock treatments, but she was never lobotomised.
They had some really horrific treatments in those days, and with my own mental health journey, I was always so worried hearing about how they used electroshock, because there was this feeling of, if I'd just been born a few decades earlier, God only knows what would have happened to me. And I actually read New Zealand writer Janet Frame's autobiography about her experiences, and it was in the 40s and 50s, and she was institutionalised, and she actually estimated that she received over 200 applications of electroshock. I can't even imagine. But she was actually scheduled for a lobotomy, but then saved because she won a National Literary Prize in 1951, just a few days before it was supposed to take place. It's not something most people have, that get out of jail free card.
I mean, that's literally what's so terrifying about all of this. And look, unfortunately for Frances, by the time she was released, her career was over. She died of cancer at 56 while writing her memoirs, and then a friend fictionalised them after her death, adding much more extreme claims, and published the book to pay off her debts. And what really gets me is Frances wanted to be taken seriously as this actress. You know, that's what her dream was. She never got that recognition, but Jessica Lange, she got an Oscar nomination for playing the fictionalised, tortured version of herself, who is raped and lobotomised. It's a very traumatic film.
Well, I guess what really interests me is why people are so much more interested in the mythologised, abused martyr version. Is it because it feeds into this intrinsic fear we all have as women of being too much or of stepping out of line, and either we'll get burnt as a witch or we'll get locked up, raped and lobotomised, you know?
Exactly. I think the thing that really struck me about Frances is that she was this opinionated, even rebellious adult woman, but she was then pushed into the guardianship of her parents. And her mother was the one that was institutionalising her for not, you know, conforming enough. And that really hits hard, because you think of your mum, she's the one that's meant to protect you, but she was complicit in this terrible abuse. Britney Spears, or as I think of her, it's Britney, bitch. I think she needs no introduction.
It's actually weird looking back on it now, because that first video has such a Lolita jailbait feel to it. It's actually quite icky, but it felt like it was sort of risque, but also really promoted at the time. So I found this comment that said, Britney was marketed in a really specific and brilliant way. They constantly emphasised her virginity and Christianity in interviews. Then she got the boob job, knee surgery, and her performances and photo shoots started to get more overtly sexual. There is no way they would ever have gotten away with that Rolling Stone photo shoot with the kid's bike and the stuffed animals today.
No, I don't think it would land the same today. And look, for a lot of us, she'll always be that glittering megastar, you know, the incredible music, videos and performances. But then these days, it's like she's more known for sort of like her strange public behaviour, her conservatorship and the dancing on Instagram. You see these kind of comments on Reddit. Sad, a 15-year-old mentally and emotionally trapped in a 43-year-old body. An entertainer used, abused and now past her sell-by date.
The idea of a woman having a sell-by date really annoys me, to be honest. And it's what we were kind of touching on in the last episode. But for me, Britney sits in that weird space like Madonna and the Spice Girls. She'll always be that pop star legend, even if she never produces music again. And she really does have some hardcore fans.
But these die-hard fans, they really were instrumental in the Free Britney movement, which gained traction in 2020. By that point, Britney had been under a conservatorship for 12 years, with her father and an attorney making every decision for her.
Well, there had definitely been some fans that had been voicing concern about the conservatorship for years. But they'd always been dismissed by Spears' father as a joke run by conspiracy theorists. But it then started to feel like a lot of people got on board after the documentary that was called Framing Britney Spears, and that was released in 2021.
I really think it helped flip the narrative. And there was this comment, I was so young when Britney went through her mental breakdown. I never realised how awful the paparazzi and public treated her. I mean, the amount of misogyny directed at her was disgusting. I really hope people watch this because it's a great insight into what she was going through.
I really think the idea of how much someone can be driven mad is one that we really wanted to explore in this episode. So there was this comment that said, "This is a perfect example of when men call women crazy." Well, tell me what you did to make her crazy.
So let's talk about what actually happened. The most famous images from her breakdown are the head shaving and the umbrella attack on the paparazzi's car. But here's the context. As Gia Tolentino of The New Yorker points out, she was 26, she had 2 children within a year, got divorced while nursing her 2-month-old, and was being relentlessly chased by photographers.
Well, I was actually recently listening to an episode of the podcast Crime Analyst called Who Framed Britney Spears with Dr. Jessica Taylor. So Dr. Jessica Taylor is a psychologist and she's the author of Sexy But Psycho, Uncovering the Psychiatric Labeling of Women and Girls. And I will say that I don't necessarily agree with all of her opinions on mental health, but I do agree with her take on Britney. And she said, "This is a woman who has been subjected to male violence over and over again in all of his different forms. She was extremely famous. And then, as you say, the media harassed her relentlessly and enjoyed it and pushed her to the brink as much as they could. They chased her around. They did everything they could to get a rise out of her and to get her to react. And then when she did, they turned, gaslight, point the finger and go, 'Look, she's crazy.'"
Exactly. She says that so well. And in her own words, Britney said that she shaved her head because she felt cornered and humiliated. She wanted to give the press some material. She called it a desperate move by a desperate person. So in a way, she knew she was performing a breakdown for them.
It's so sad. The paparazzi culture of the early noughties was incredibly aggressive and it was really big business before everyone had social media. So I saw this comment that said, back then, companies like TMZ would give big payouts for the most intimate and private photos of celebrities that could create headlines. And there was actually some suggestions that she might have been suffering from postpartum depression at the time. So to be honest, I think I would have snapped under those conditions as well.
Oh, me too.
And for me, it's so interesting that the immediate framing of the head shaving is, oh, she's crazy. As in, you've got to be crazy to want to destroy your conventional beauty. And in terms of the lashing out at the paps, well, Alec Baldwin, Sean Penn, they both had equally violent incidents. Yeah. And they were mostly called aggressive assholes or along those lines. But they weren't called crazy in the same way as they did to Britney.
That is so true. But here's the thing, in January 2008, things really escalated. Britney locked herself in the bathroom with her son Jaden and refused to hand him over to Kevin's security team. She was then taken out on a stretcher and placed on what they call a 5150 hold.
Which, for anyone who doesn't know, that's a 72-hour involuntary psychiatric hospitalisation for evaluation. And within weeks, the conservatorship had started. And we should just be clear on what that actually means. So from her own testimony, she couldn't remove her IUD, she couldn't choose her own lawyer, she couldn't spend her own money without permission, she couldn't drive, and she couldn't see friends without approval. So her father and an attorney made just about every single decision in her life.
When you read that out, it is really shocking. I thought she was free in a way, but like with Frances Farmer, she's effectively reduced to a child. I saw this comment that said, "Have there ever been any famous men put under a conservatorship like this? Strikes me as very patriarchal."
I mean, Kanye is such an obvious comparison for that. He also publicly struggled with mental health. He's been put under a 5150 hold before, and both of them have gone on these really bizarre Twitter rants. But I saw this comment that highlighted the difference. Britney goes through a mental health crisis, she has her rights taken away. Kanye goes through a mental health crisis, gets to run for president.
It's just so ridiculous.
I mean, yes. Well, at the time, she was also being surrounded by people who really seemed to be taking advantage of her. So Sam Lufty was one. She even ended up dating a paparazzi who had been stalking her. And both of these guys were accused of keeping her drugged up to control her. So I could understand her family trying to get her away from them and maybe using the conservatorship to do that.
But as many pointed out in the comments, they were talking about the hypocrisy that she was seen as too unwell, too unfit to work and make any decisions and to look after herself. But then within a year, They had her out working full-time and earning huge amounts of money. As this comment says, Jamie Spears says that Britney has dementia and is not capable of taking care of herself and her finances, driving or seeing her friends, but somehow it's okay to go on 3 world tours, do a 4-year Las Vegas residency, land a $50 million deal on X Factor and release 4 albums.
I mean, a lot of people were making money off her during that time. So her dad was actually paid $6 million just to be a conservator. Mm-hmm. And over $30 million were paid in fees to law firms throughout her conservatorship.
Oh, my God.
And ex-husband Kevin Federline, he received almost $500,000 every year in child support and alimony.
I mean, being Britney is big business.
It really is. And it now seems like her ex-husband is trying to cash in with his own tell-all book about her called You Thought You Knew. And this is very conveniently since Britney finally stopped paying child support payments last year when her youngest son turned 18.
I think he was paid around $1 million. So this book is full of allegations, that Britney was drinking while pregnant, using cocaine before breastfeeding, about erratic behaviour around the boys, feeding their son shellfish despite severe allergies, punching Preston in the face. Perhaps most disturbingly, he alleges the children woke up to find her watching them sleep with a knife in her hand.
Look, if that's true, that is very worrying. But I will say that Federline is definitely an unreliable narrator. I feel like every comment I've seen has been pretty scathing about him. So, for example, this one, the guy's entire resume is once married to Britney Spears. Every time he runs out of money, he dusts off her name like it's a winning lottery ticket. And also, yes, when your children's mother seems to be struggling mentally, the solution is, of course, to broadcast her worst moments to the masses and profit from that.
I do understand where they're coming from in these comments, but this isn't the first time, allegations like this have surfaced. In 2010, a former bodyguard claimed Britney hit her son with a belt, and that Child Services investigated and closed the case. And Federline himself called the allegations baseless and motivated by money at the time.
So there's basically a pattern here of accusations being made, investigated, and either dismissed or settled for money, which makes it really hard to know what's real and when someone's just trying to profit off her. It also feels like the worst thing a woman can be labelled is an unfit mother. I mean, we have the term deadbeat dad, but it doesn't really seem to be anywhere near as scathing. So I saw this comment that said, women are expected to have that motherly instinct, that drive to make and subsequently take care of a kid. Men, on the other hand, aren't. So when a woman isn't the primary parent, it goes against the grain and blows people's minds. And this comment, parenting is an activity men get to choose. Motherhood is supposedly what women are.
But I think a lot of people were thinking and hoping that if she found her freedom, she would go back to the way she was. After calling 911 for conservatorship abuse and giving devastating public testimony, Britney was finally released from it in November 2021.
But it's now actually been 4 years since she was given her freedom, and she still continued to be covered and picked apart by the media. So during this time, she got married and divorced from her long-term boyfriend, and she released an explosive memoir that was called The Woman in Me, and it actually sold over 2.4 million copies in its first week. Even then, with her own memoir and telling her truth, she's still actually not believed by everyone, and she's also been posting a lot of social media content.
Yes, the Instagram. There's a lot of dancing videos, skimpy clothes, and just a lot of confusing posts, to be honest, Sarah. There was these comments. I have to believe that Spears does have serious mental health issues from seeing those bizarre videos she posts where she's coochie-cooing all over the place. And there was this comment. Those rambling social media posts aren't doing her any favours and are validating her ongoing need for mental health care.
Well, for me, the comments seem to be split into very different camps. So there's a lot of people defending her and saying she's under too much scrutiny. So, for example, if the worst she's doing is making dance videos, then where's the issue? She's been dancing and twirling since day one. The only difference now is she's not as glammed up as she would be if she were doing a video shoot. Mm-hmm. I'm sure ageism is part of where the concern comes from. And others are also pointing out that she essentially has these long-term effects from the abuse she suffered. So someone said, yes, she doesn't speak perfectly. She's insanely nervous and traumatized and has been on forced medication. She's literally scared. Y'all stop judging.
But there's also a lot of people that are genuinely concerned or even critical. There was this comment, it's getting more and more painful to watch and really making me question my support of the Free Britney movement. And finally, this comment, I'm bored of us being gaslit by this situation. Two things can be true. Her family took advantage of her mental illness, and she also needs to be looked after. The woman is clearly mentally ill, but because it's Britney, nobody must say this. We all have to stay silent, regardless of her behaviour she puts out to the world.
I do definitely agree that two things can be true at once, and it always seems like people really struggle with that concept. So it's usually simplified down into you're either for someone or against someone, or for a topic or against a topic, you know?
I think that's exactly it. And here's the thing. After the Free Britney movement and all the allegations of conservatorship abuse, it feels like there's this pressure where you're not allowed to express any concern without being accused of wanting to control her again. You know, as this comment, it's like as long as the media dubs you a victim, you can do no wrong, and even weird behaviour gets praised, especially if you're a super celebrity like her.
But a lot of people, including Federline, are actually arguing that it's an accident waiting to happen. So there was this comment: unfortunately, it feels as though this is all heading towards a very tragic conclusion, at which point the press and everyone else will wring their hands about how sad it is and how she was failed, once again spectacularly failing to recognise their part in it. And she's definitely come under a lot of renewed scrutiny just this week because of this new memoir that's come out. And right on cue, there was another story that literally just came out about her acting erratically when she went to a restaurant with a friend. And the Daily Mail was branding it a terrifying spiral and driving dangerously.
And you can almost predict the comments. There was this: lock her up or put her in a psych ward where she belongs before she kills somebody.
I mean, that's a bit extreme.
Yeah. But there is this sense of dread about her. On Monday, 74% of Mail Online readers in a poll think she should never have been freed from her conservatorship. But why are we all just watching? I mean, how many people are genuinely expecting her to make it to 50?
Well, look, I think it's important to not just voyeuristically watch and do nothing. But there's a huge spectrum between providing a vulnerable person with support and locking her up. And for me, it's also really important to ask about how the media frame the narrative and the context. So I saw this comment that said, let's have a vulnerable person have a tell-all book spawned by an ex grasping for money now the child-attached bank has stopped. Then follow her in a car and take pictures as she seems to be driving erratically, then make your money off that. Disgusting. And I do think it's so easy to make her look crazy or dangerous. The exact same story was framed as just a fun night out by TMZ.
Exactly. It's the same playbook. Britney crisis, photograph the crisis, profit from the crisis. And there was this comment: I think we need to be careful not to infantilise Britney Spears. She's a mother of two in her 40s. She needs to sort herself out for the sake of her children, if not for herself.
Look, it's very hard because she does look like she needs some kind of help. But as I said, help can come in many different forms, and it's unclear what her exact diagnosis is. And I can also say from experience that psychiatric diagnosis can be very subjective. I myself have been misdiagnosed. I've been put on medication that made things worse, not better. And when you're ill, you're not really in a position to stand up for yourself or argue back against the so-called experts. So it's a really difficult situation.
I can really understand that. And I was thinking about her and that she's had this freedom stripped from her for 13 years. I mean, how do you sort of sort yourself out when you've never been allowed to sort yourself out?
I think that's really well said, because what's so sad for me is that it feels like the one thing she really wants is to be loved and to have a family. And unfortunately, it seems like something that she might never attain. Whatever you think of her, she's in this position where it's really hard to separate out what is the result of trauma and abuse. What is the long-term effects from drugs, both illegal and clinically forced on her? And sort of no matter what she does, it will always be seen through this lens of someone who's been permanently stamped with the crazy label. So her voice has basically permanently been taken away, because once you're diagnosed as mentally unstable, it doesn't matter how much work you do to heal. You're basically an unreliable narrator who can never be trusted.
I mean, sadly, that does seem to be the case. There's this awful sense that people are watching and waiting. Waiting for what? You know, a comeback like Lindsay Lohan, a tragic ending?
I mean, it is depressing, isn't it? Because from a PR perspective, there's just no redemptive arc available to her. To come back, you'd have to prove you're better, but she doesn't really want to return to the music industry. She said that explicitly. And even if she did, would anyone believe her? Or would they just be looking for signs of the next breakdown?
Exactly. And I do think it's so hard to watch her publicly spiral. I did get a little bit emotional looking at her Instagram. She was dancing to Rihanna's Mother Mary, mouthing the words, Mother Mary, I really want to change. And her eyes looked so sad. And she had an outfit on that looked like the one from, when she was a schoolgirl in Baby One More Time. And it just hit me. She's stuck in that moment forever. Forever the teenager we fell in love with. I have these feelings that she has the resources and I just wish she'd get help.
I mean, I really wish that for her too. But I feel like, unfortunately, her resources just seem to make her more of a target for exploitation because there doesn't seem to be anyone trustworthy around her. Well, on the whole, the stigma from mental health has improved. We don't have lobotomies anymore, and you mostly can't be institutionalised for life. And there are more and more celebrities who are actually speaking out about their own mental health journeys.
I do find it interesting that this new generation of pop stars, like I'm thinking of Billie Eilish, Eilish. Is it Eilish? Billie Eilish.
It's Eilish. Yeah, it's Eilish. Billie Eilish.
Billie Eilish.
I know.
That famous Irish pop star. Billie Eilish.
The one who dances all the ballet.
Look, she's been very open about her depression and self-harm. And I didn't realise, but there's this whole thing called the sad girl aesthetic. It's all these big oversized clothes, the dead eyes. They call it the dead eyes, the melancholy. It seems to be a whole thing now.
I'm not as familiar with it, but to be honest, for me, it's really just a modern incarnation of what we used to call in our day the goth or the emo girl, or even just the cult of Sylvia Plath. And it does feel like every generation has its own version of this.
Yeah. I mean, I seem to find a way to always bring it back to Winona Ryder. But look, but when you do go online, there does seem to be this sort of romanticisation of mental illness and neurodivergence.
Yeah, I definitely know what you're talking about. But I also think, like you said about Billie Eilish, there's a really positive side to it as well. There are a lot more celebrities being honest and vulnerable and just spreading awareness. So for me, Selena Gomez is a really good example. She released a documentary in 2022 and she discussed her mental health struggles. And there was this comment, I feel that Selena opening up to the world about having bipolar and having to go to the hospital for it makes a very big difference in the public perception. People look up to celebrities, and I think that people are more accepting of a celebrity that they like or idolise.
But saying all this, it does feel like that some mental health diagnoses are not seen in the same way. For example, schizophrenia, some personality disorders, they're still viewed with a lot of stigma, and that has real world consequences, doesn't it? I mean, especially in the workplace.
It definitely does. And I think if your mental illness is situational, then it's often seen as more acceptable. But if you are perceived as generally and inherently, unhinged, then you're seen as unsafe. So if you're depressed or anxious, especially as a woman, they're viewed as quite passive illnesses. And so I think it fits into this fragile stereotype of the damsel in distress. So it's just much more acceptable. It's more palatable, particularly if it's in response to something. So say you're depressed because of a breakup. Oh, okay, that makes sense. That's what we expect, But if it's a personality disorder or schizophrenia, I think a lot of people think, oh, they could be dangerous. Maybe they're manipulative. They can't be trusted. And I just think those diagnoses can really unfairly have a permanent and negative impact on their lives.
Yes, and especially when it comes to employment. According to a report by the Journal of Royal Society of Medicine, in England, 40% of people with mental health problems say they were denied a job because of their history of psychiatric treatment. And about 60% avoid applying for jobs because they expect to be dealt with unfairly. And here's the really striking bit. In one study, employers were 7 times more likely to recommend hiring an applicant with a physical disability than someone with a mental illness.
I mean, 7 times is just extraordinary.
I know. And I was actually looking at research by the foundation called See Me, who are working to reduce the stigma of mental health in the workplace. They found that one woman was offered a job, but it was then rescinded when they learned that she had bipolar.
It definitely seems like there's still a big problem, particularly in the more corporate industries and with certain diagnoses, unfortunately.
Exactly. So I was thinking, okay, you might not get locked up in an asylum, but you could definitely be locked out of work. And I don't need to tell you that can have a very devastating outcome.
And this is particularly worrying when you think about how subjective psychiatric diagnosis is. So there was this study in 2009, and it found that women with symptoms of heart disease showed that they were twice as likely to be diagnosed with a mental illness compared with men who reported the exact same symptoms.
Wow.
And this was even worse for women of colour.
I mean, that is really disturbing.
Well, absolutely. And I was actually listening to a really good analysis of the damage of over-medicalisation of mental health. And that was on Dr. Jessica Taylor's podcast. And what she said was, the problem is with mental health, and from a medical perspective, is that once you put a psychiatric diagnosis on someone's file, they will carry that and they might be discriminated against for that. And it might not even be relevant, or it might not even be correct.
Again, that is really concerning.
I mean, it definitely is. And she goes on to put this in a real world context by saying children anywhere between 11 to sort of 17 were diagnosed with personality disorders, with schizophrenia, with psychosis, and they're now adults. They can't get jobs, they can't go to college, they can't get independent living because their file says that they're mentally unstable.
I mean, this is why I find it so complicated. It's really this double-edged sword because you need the diagnosis to get the help, but then the label itself can be so difficult to manage.
It's a real catch-22.
You know, when we did our Karen episode, our Karen hunting, or like viral shaming Karens, this idea that older women potentially dealing with hormonal issues due to the menopause are immediately dismissed as hysterical or irrationally angry. And there was this comment I found on LinkedIn. We need more dialogue on what to expect and what options there are during menopause, since it affects each person differently. It could be the first experience some people have with health and mental health related struggles.
Yeah, and for me, it feels like these issues are completely exacerbated by the fact that women's health is just not treated with as much understanding or even research. So I've spoken to so many women who've said that they've been dismissed when they went to their doctor struggling with, you know, what was termed unexplained symptoms. And also how quickly they jump to suggesting hysterectomies. And that's something I've even experienced myself.
I mean, we've talked about this. It's just so extreme. But the positive thing, there is so much more awareness now. You know, at least now we can go on Google and, for better or worse, empower ourselves with the information, which is something our grandmothers never had. And it feels like we've taken some of that power back from the men in white coats.
It does, but I also just want to bring in this quote by Dr. Jessica Taylor again, who said, well, we're not burning women anymore, but we are pathologizing them. We are discrediting them. We're not listening to them. And I do think that there is progress in many ways. But this archetype of the hysterical woman, it's so ingrained in our culture that it continues to skew the way we view women and men's behaviour, and that's really a problem.
I mean, we've gone from Frances Farmer being supposedly lobotomised for what might have been a substance abuse problem and erratic behaviour, to Britney Spears being placed under a conservatorship for what might have been postpartum depression and a mental health crisis, to today, where I do think some workplaces, not all, claim they support mental health, but if you actually disclose a diagnosis or show signs of struggle, I do think it can seriously affect your career opportunities.
But for me, at the end of the day, I will say that I'm really grateful to have grown up when I did, rather than in Frances Farmer's era. And I'm sure the generations that are being born now will also have access to more understanding about their own mental health than even we did. I've had a whole range of experiences through mental health crises where I gave or had my power and voice taken away. But I think it was through those experiences that I've now learnt to be much more empowered in managing my own health. And I really know how to stand up for myself in medical situations after learning this. It's like, yeah, I do know myself and my body, and ultimately I'm the one who has to live with the consequences for whatever medication or treatment that I'm prescribed. And so in those situations now, I will say, no, that doesn't work for me if it doesn't feel right. And I know very much that that's a privilege, but it's a really hard fought one through some quite shitty experiences, to be honest.
You've done an amazing job. And you know what has struck me during this episode? It's, you know, how the language has changed, but it's still the same thing in a way. Growing up, do you remember people used to say, oh, she's having a nervous breakdown, or she's hysterical? But actually in 1980, doctors officially deleted the term hysteria from the psychiatric handbook. But now I just feel it's like you're called dramatic, unstable, or too emotional. It's the same dismissal, just different words.
I think as a society, we do still have a lot to change. But as an individual, I also think it's about taking the cards that you've been dealt, however shitty, and finding a way to turn your weaknesses into your strengths. So for me, my mental health battles have actually allowed me to develop this greater sense of empathy for others. And I'm not sure that I would have gained that without the level of suffering that I've been through.
So I think this is what we want to say to you, is that if you're listening and you've ever been called emotional or dismissed by a doctor or told you're overreacting, you're not imagining it, and you're definitely not alone. And I think what I'm taking away from all this is next time we see a woman being called crazy in the tabloids, in the comments, maybe we just all ask, who benefits from that label? What's the full story? And what would we want people to say about us at our absolute worst?
And as Jane Goodall said, it actually doesn't take much to be considered a difficult woman. That's why there are so many of us. So, yeah, that's how we're going to end it for today, on something a little bit more positive. But, I think I need to go and get a cup of tea now.
I think so. And I'm going to get my smelling salts and find my wandering womb.
Oh, where's it gone? Did
it actually go somewhere? Like, I'd like to know. Did it go on holiday?
Yeah.
It's so cold in Norway right now. I'd love to take my womb off to Australia. But look.
It's getting a bit too hot here, actually. Don't come.
Don't come. But thank you. I think this is a really special episode for both of us. And thank you for listening today. I know it's been a heavy topic, but we both feel it's just really important to talk about this.
Yeah, I mean, it means a lot to both of us. And so we also just want to say, get in touch if you need. We love hearing from you. And just for everyone listening at home, please just be as kind to yourselves as you can.
And I think next week, or in a couple of weeks, we're coming back with a more royal-themed episode. So hold on to your hats, ladies. It's going to be a big one.
It is. And we'll see you next time. And thanks again for listening.
Bye for now.